I like that muscle right there. But anyway, to be real, um, I've been holding back on doing any types of videos like this, specifically because I wanted everything to die down, and I also wanted to see how it was going to play out in terms of people and self-control and control of cells, whichever way applies. Um, this video is going to be relatively long, and I might break it up into different pieces depending on how long it actually takes to get done, because I have a lot of information and perspective to speak on. So I'd like to start off by saying that no one holds your worth unless you allow them to. This is different than John Locke's theory of government, which is um, each party signs an agreement, and one gives up some of their freedoms so that they can have the protections and or resources of the bigger entity. So I'd like to start off by saying like some of my sources for this information. First of all would be my grandmother, so a direct source of the people of myself, which I may get into later in the video. Second was a fourth grade teacher I met. He appeared to be a typical black man, but he literally got a scholarship for being Native American, and that opened my eyes up further in terms of what my grandmother was already teaching me. Another, I met a Choctaw chief in Louisiana, and same idea as to his appearance rather than who he actually is and identifies. Then an older man who is both Native and African American, and he also gave me some of the insights about why older people don't really speak about these things even now. And last but not least, my own research into all of these subjects for many years. So with that said, on to the next point. So the biggest thing that I promote as a person is that there's two sides to this current problem, and one is that African American and or black people, I'll just call them black people because of what I will be getting into in the next segment. But black American people are separated from education and knowledge of who they are familially, but also culturally, and they were stripped of that and forced to learn a manufactured culture. So it's impossible. It's not impossible now, but for the longest time it was impossible for anyone to know who they were unless they were lucky, or unless there was some underground movement of some sort within their own immediate community that was resistant to the influences around them, which goes into institutionalized racism, which I'll get into also. And the second problem is anyone outside of that who had contributed to the power structure that was designed to keep this slave population without power. They obviously don't exist anymore, and the few that do are, of course, a minority of who people think are actually the problem. So the people that exist today on either side of this issue are very close to being level in terms of the amount of education that they have about each other. But I mean, it's honestly impossible to know what another human being is experiencing, because you can't physically experience that, but you can have empathy for that as far as it goes. But at some point it comes down to responsibility of communities and the individual to come to that. So for my next point, I wanted to start off by giving an idea for both sides of this issue as to who and what the American black person actually is, versus the common narrative that proclaims that they are purely African people. In between 1306 and 1311, there have been documented ships leaving from the west coast of Africa, but also similar documentation stating that these same ships arrived on the coast of Brazil. And this is not documentation from our education system. It's documentation from these countries. And basically, there is a current that leads directly and easily between these two areas. And of course, this is before Columbus discovered the Americas, but it obviously had been happening way before that. In world history, we know that people have been sailing the seas for a long time. So there's no telling when this actually started, of course, but this is just a documented thing. So then that's already a connection as to how the demographics of South America and North America are slightly different from each other, even though they're related. And also the connection to Africa outside of the transatlantic slave trade, which, mind you, the transatlantic slave trade is a triangle, so it's not it never stated that. It wasn't exactly one direction. It was actually a triangle like they showed you it was. So slaves in and slaves out, and we'll get into what the makeup of slaves have been over a matter of time. So anyway, in 1940, all of the hybrid black Americans were called Negroes, and people were categorized based off of their features versus what their true identities were. So if it was a person who was mixed, regardless of what that was, and they looked too much a certain way, then that's what they would just automatically be categorized off of. Because again, this was based off of racism, not necessarily off of rationality. Just like how Hitler used to identify people via their head shape and nose shape and eye color and all of that. Even though sometimes that can be an indicator, but it's not always accurate. Actually, it's kind of rarely accurate when it comes to someone's genetic makeup, which is genetic. So anyway, so by the 1800s, all brown people were all brown folks in North America were of mixed heritage, meaning that you could not be this color or darker and not be mixed in America. I mean, of course you could be, but you were a minority, meaning that even the people, remember I was talking about the people who are on the boats that had been here, they'd been in different parts of America by this point, because that's about 500 years between the two. So you got people that went to way far south, the middle south, and potentially the high south, right, east USA, where I'm at, and essentially were there with Native American people from the Mongoloid stock, meaning people that were Asiatic from the Bering Strait that crossed over in a different manner, and everybody just started mixing with each other. They didn't necessarily have problems with each other outside of, what the average Native American had issues with another Native American, which usually had to go along the lines of whether they were patriarchal or matriarchal. And to be specific, that means that patriarchal is the masculine way of organization, which means that there's one person at the top and then there's levels underneath it, because of course that causes people to have to compete for things, which is why someone would be more inclined to steal somebody else's resources or start a fight with somebody to take their resources, which is kind of what Columbus and everybody else who was in the slave trade was trying to do, because they were running out of resources and they wanted more, and there was plenty in this new world. But anyway, matrilineal is more of a sharing basis, and actually in the same case there were a lot of tribes in the southeast United States that were matrilineal, and that also had female chiefs. They had male chiefs sometimes too, but a lot of the chiefs were female, and also the tribe was passed down through the mother versus the father. So even if your father was Cherokee and your mother was Seminole, you are Seminole if you come from your mother. So anyway, back to the timeline situation. So from the 1800s, where everybody was mixed now, of course, slavery happened before that. So, people had already either had their underground movements, or they were already free, but they looked like they were, just like African people, but African by standards that people create to like categorize people. And then also the people that were just recently freed. And so in the 1960s, everyone knows of this movement, and between, of course, the 1800s and the 1960s, that's about the time when everyone started becoming more aware that there was inequality. And, of course, we had all the movements that were necessary to get as far as we have gotten up to, the 80s, and then again today. It hasn't really been something that stopped. But of course there's been different cultures in the meantime, because nothing really stops moving in this whole frame. So the idea of an American black person just is consistently being turned over in terms of national perception and world perception, yet different parts of the world actually already know information more than the average general American person. But we're not going to get into that because it's not about education at this moment. So let's talk about slavery. So the world is a very old place, and slavery is a very old industry that has been all over the world in all different cultures. Sometimes people selling their own into slavery, and sometimes people their own, and sometimes people selling other people into slavery. That absolutely does not make it a good thing or a right thing. It is just simply a fact. Some of the various peoples that have been slaves, the Tartars, Greeks, Bulgarians, Muslims, Turkish, Russians, and of course Africans, South Americans, Native Americans, Native American, Native American, etc. So that's just something that needs to be understood, that even though people, black Americans, are the current people that have been subjected to this ancient and you could say barbaric custom or barbaric system of trying to get money, and it should be the last. We should stop human trafficking, but it is not the first group for it to happen to. So leading on to the next thing, so as I was talking about earlier about patriarchy, what ends up happening is there's a drain on resources when it comes down to one thing being the absolute leader of anything. And of course, human nature is something funny. So, if you end up having a bunch of patriarchal societies that each believes that it should be the leader of all, it causes wars and causes greed, and it ends up causing for people to do things that they might not do in other circumstances. But you can't really put that as an argument, because that's a if then what. It can only really be what it is, right? But that's the point. So basically it all leads to greed, which is mostly what slaves are about, because you don't the slave doesn't really benefit from that arrangement. It's not a fair system of government whatsoever between that a slave owner and that slave. Of course, there's different types of slavery, but we're talking about one specific one at this point. So the next is why some elders do not speak about it. Even the ones especially that experienced the 1960s and that are still alive. So I was speaking to someone recently, and he proudly identifies, proudly but quietly, identifies as Native American. And so I asked my most recent revelator as to why, and I've noticed this with other African American or supposed African American people. These are mixed people with European, Native American, and African. And I was like, why is it something that's quiet? Because just as significant a chunk of African DNA as Native American DNA and sometimes European DNA. All of those in different concoctions together makes the Black African American person, which is why they're not really African American. They're Black people who don't know their culture. But anyway, it's because of the Trail of Tears. So about the time that the Trail of Tears happened, a lot of people were afraid to be taken down the Trail of Tears, which is yet another American tragedy where natives were stripped from their land and forced to walk thousands of miles to Oklahoma to be put in camps. So the people that could pass for not being Native American would claim that they were not Native American. They would claim Negro or Black, or some of them were labeled that, and some of them claimed it, so that they would not have to be put through that. So the next thing is culture and the American Negro. So as I was saying earlier, it's difficult for people to be able to understand everybody's perspective, and the extent that the average American, whatever culture and color they are, for them to know about their history, whether that be from privilege or be from the lack of the privilege of not having to know, or the privilege of, or the non-privilege of not being able to know, causes the average American, nowadays, which compared to people of other countries is usually privileged, to be honest, now, and versus like when people were still actually slaves. Of course, that doesn't make the inequality in our community, in our society, correct at all. It just means that there's a lot of people in the world going through bad things too. So anyway, let me see. So keeping in mind that the Black people were not aware of their culture, or some Black people are not aware of their culture, or what the significance of that would be. And also because the winners are usually the person who proclaim the indoctrination or the education that's given to the average person. So multiple waves of multiple people from Native American, Black, African, Middle Eastern, Caucasian, like the Vikings actually got here before Christopher Columbus too, but that was mostly on the California coast, and their genetic remnants are left there as well. But anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to make it a real point that Black peoples of America are definitely mixed, and the peoples that are more likely to be like the most African are in South America. And even there, like so there were a few communities that were able to free themselves from their captors, and even then they mixed with the people that were already there from the land. So either the people that were already mixed from the previous Africans coming and mixing with the Native Americans, or they mixed with the Native Americans that were there themselves and that made like a half and half community, or they mixed with people like themselves only, and that would make like pockets of like black, like African people in those communities. And so these peoples, all three categories of these peoples, which there's actually another one, which is the European and the Native American coming together, or the European and the African coming together, because it's not exclusive. Like all of this is a lot of people and a lot of time for everybody to like mix up with each other. So these people, in addition to the new people now that were being brought from either South America or Africa or even Europe in some instances, and the reason why they were brought from Europe in some instances was because they won a war in previous time, and somebody was mad and they were like, oh, we're going to grab these people and put them into slavery. So basically every black American person is mixed. They're not African. They are part African for sure. There's no doubt about that, because that's the legacy right now of the most recent bout of slavery in America. So, institutionalized racism was implemented via that when people, even before, but when people really started becoming freed from these bonds initially, it became more of a psychological game to keep people from knowing who they were. So the peoples who became slaves, not the people who did not become slaves, because the people who did not become slaves know who they are. The people who ended up becoming slaves were beaten into taking on a new cultural identity and a new religion and a new everything, so that moving forward they would only be able to move within that, with that fake identity, within a structure that was designed specifically to keep them from moving anywhere else. So in essence, slavery again, but it didn't look like it and it didn't appear like it, and technically it was better because there was a chance that somebody could free themselves from that. So let's make this better. Like, how do we make this a better situation? And finally now, after all these riots and stuff was going on, a lot of leaders have started stepping up to try to, propose different ways that this could be. And I honestly don't have the whole answer to that, because I am not in as deep as the government part of it in terms of how to move things around versus the educational part of it. Personally, I have my own things that I'm doing, to address it for me and my, perspectives and the people that know me and all of that. But in terms of like for the wider expanse of things, it really has to take everybody working together as a team. And I believe that a lot of the peoples in America, black, white, Native American, Latino, Asian, also, because Asian people have also been slaves to a degree in America and put on camps in America, but most people don't know about that stuff either. So everybody's been dealt a deal, depending on who and why, when, and all of that stuff. And I mean, that's human life, isn't it? Like, we never really I mean, some things are better than others. Of course, it's not good. It's definitely not good, but hold on. Life is about, improvement. So, first, let's find our personal roots, whether that be DNA testing or, going to family and talking about it, and then also making programs for other people to become educated on it. I know that personally, the education I got in a public setting was actually part of what started me knowing the truth, just because my German history teacher took it upon himself to make sure that, we got good information and understood that history was always written from the winners versus it necessarily being the whole truth. We also had different types of study, like theory of thought and psychology. So, it's not a far stretch for all of that to be understood of how it really fits, with life, as well as biology. So anybody who bases, your classification off of your genetic appearance or your phenotype is an idiot because they don't understand basic biology. So just saying. Aside from that, get mental health for you and your family and your community, meaning that there's a lot of pain and hurt, which is part of the reasons why everyone is outcrying about what's happening, and this is not necessarily um, to stop anything that's happening, because the movement that's now currently happening is good. What was happening, in terms of the reckless stuff, though, the emotional stuff, I mean, I don't have any comments that I'm going to make on here about that. All I'm going to say is that, we all understand, every human being has pain. And if you have a whole lot of pain that you need help getting healed, you should go to a professional or figure out a way to handle pain. And last but not least, participate in government. So whether that be you voting for your current government, or whether that be understanding how your ancient peoples used to govern themselves. Just participate in government and understand how change happens, so that you can become an active, willing, and equal participant within your community. So, with that, that's all I wanted to say. I'll leave a few links in the description, like with some more resources to check out, whether it be educational or whether that be, just some starting off education in terms of the stuff that I've outlined here. Please feel free to follow or subscribe to me here. I'm also on Instagram. I do music, I do artwork, I write, I do a lot of things, so just check me out. And I appreciate you watching this video. I hope it gave you some more perspective on like what the whole picture of the monumental things that are happening right now is, and also hopefully it gave somebody a sense, or more of a sense, of who they are in relation to the world, so that they can make more sense for them. So peace, later.